So our next speaker is from a company that I admire a lot, because I admire the CEO of the company so much, Mark Benioff, CEO of Salesforce. So when we saw a talk submitted by Salesforce, and not only by Salesforce, but basically the head of innovation for the R&D group at Salesforce, we knew we had something very special on our hands. So without further ado, and I've lost my notes here. I've lost your name. Vineet? Yes. Let's bring up Vineet from Salesforce.
Thank you.
Come on up. And you're mic'd up, right?
Yeah,
okay,
I think so.
Great. Thank you.
Thanks. Wow. You guys can feel it, right? It's like, it feels like we're in the middle of a revolution, like just picking up steam. When I started doing stuff with voice about 18 months ago, I hit a whole bunch of challenges and started trying to do stuff about it. We at Salesforce are trying to push the edge in innovation, especially for enterprises. And so when we heard about this conference, I wanted to make sure I brought together our notes and try to have something here that will be really helpful to you guys. Now, there's a lot of devices out there. It's really nice. I have something on my bedside table. I have something that is sitting by my desk when I'm working. I have in the kitchen, of course. But my favorite device is that little Amazon has this wand where you can carry it in your hand. You can go from room to room, use it whenever, and just put it in your pocket. Voice is a natural interface to work with computers. You must have heard this a bunch of times, and the potential for it is incredible. This is partly why they're projecting about 3 years for 50% of the households in the United States to have a device sitting inside each and every one's house. But that's just the tip of the iceberg, right? Because we all have smartphones. We have voice-enabled things everywhere, and we can do so much with it. The problem, though, is that while voice is a natural interface, most applications today are limited. I've highlighted the can. Voice can be a natural interface today. We're not there yet. When I'm using a smart speaker today to find out restaurant information, something that I do often enough with my wife by my side, I'm asking for, which restaurants are nearby, but depending on the situation, I want something that I can walk to or something that might have alcohol. Today, I would have to say, not just which restaurants are nearby, but I would need to say which restaurants are nearby that serve alcohol. And sometimes I'd get the right answer. In contrast, for a natural interface, you want to have something more on the right side. Where can I get dinner? Yeah, but which of those ones actually serve alcohol? Now, this is not me trying to create some made-up artificial queries that don't happen. Like, you talk to another human being, you do end up needing the system to take advantage of what we call context. It's not surprising that today, a lot of skills exist that are really sort of low level, like on the left-hand side there. And the reason they're that way is because the APIs are mostly low level. This is a young space. It's a space that's growing rapidly. But there are good skills there, good apps there. We and I, in particular, have been spending a lot of time studying them, talking to a number of companies that have built some of the top skills, trying to see what lessons we can get from that. And how can we make it easier for everyone to be doing that? And that's what a lot of this session is all about. There are 4 parts, in my opinion, to making this happen. I'm going to cover a lot more details about part 3 and part 4 through the rest of this presentation. But just to be complete, building for the mobile apps was different than building for a web app. You wouldn't just the first generation, you would just put a web page inside of a smartphone, but that didn't have as much of an impact. The gap between a mobile device today and a voice interface is even larger. So, the first thing is you're not just cloning something for voice. You need to rethink it. The use cases end up being slightly different. Just as an example, I built a to-do list application on Alexa, and the first thing I was guessing was, I want to know all the items that I need to do today, need to be able to add stuff. But then as I was using it, I got to know that I don't really care about all the items on my task list when I'm using a voice device. What I really cared about was what was the topmost thing that I needed. I don't have the patience when I'm using a voice interface most of the time to be completely holistic in an answer. I wanted something quick. Again, this use case may differ for whatever you guys are doing, but you need to think about voice slightly differently. And partly because the voice, I'm going to say, use cases are so different than web and mobile, just realize that it's a different muscle, and you need to be hyper agile, not just doing agile for the sake of agile, but building something, putting it out, and getting feedback. And that gets to the interesting bits, which is I value user experience a lot, but even me, I was having a hard time thinking about the user experience. You need to actually not be a coder that can do user experience. You need to dedicate time to be in that user experience mode. And then of course you need to build it. I'm going to talk a lot more about it, but just a quick show of hands. How many people out here think that user experience in the voice world is incredibly important? Okay, about half the people, more than that. What about, how many of you have done some user experience stuff while doing voice? So not necessarily it's the most important thing, but you felt like you needed to sort of up-level your user experience once you built something. Okay. No, I wouldn't say simultaneously. And maybe this is my limitation as a human being. I have never been able to, when building a web app and a mobile app, I am able to simultaneously think about the user experience as I'm building features. But when building a voice app, I haven't been able to do it simultaneously. I've needed to dedicate time to think about it. Actually, I built something, I've been incredibly frustrated with it, dedicated time to it, and then, that's not bad, it's getting there. And so, let's talk about the user experience. There's a lot of information out there. There's a lot of it that will overwhelm you, or at least it overwhelmed me. But I think the best way to start about it is to think about conversational flows. If you look at the first generation of what I would call a voice skill, voice app, was very command response driven. The lowest level, I would say level 0 is communicating at a REST API level and doing sort of a little hello world. You build a more interesting app, it's more event-based. It's that command response thing that I was sort of complaining about. You want to actually build something that is more interesting than that, you need to take advantage of the state, and it starts to become context aware. Whether it is aware of the context that you just said 5 minutes ago, or whether it is aware of the fact that you said that your preference is that you like about family-related cars, for example, because you've got kids, and you want that information when you're having a conversation with your voice application. Beyond just tracking the state, what you need to do also is look at the conversational flow. And I'm getting into this, but it is that style of discussion that you have with somebody. If it was somebody who was just subservient to you and would just be answering questions to you, it's one thing. But if it's somebody intelligent that's working with you, he or she is trying to understand what you're asking for, and then appropriately asking questions. You're taking, in the UX world, it's called mixed initiative, and to be able to design that is a little bit of a challenge. Now, conversational flows do a good job of tracking it. This is an example from the web. I've posted some links there. But you're basically looking at an average conversation and you're designing it out. Okay, in this kind of diagram, my recommendation is to first start with writing some sample dialogues, like you're writing a play. See what people want to do, and it sort of removes any constraints from what you're doing. Secondly, once you've got that, think of the beginner user and try to create that kind of a diagram. And then thirdly, once you've got that beginner experience, then figure out what the advanced user will be doing. Because a beginner user using an app will need a lot more prompts and will need more hand-holding. That advanced user who's been using that app for a bunch of time will get frustrated very quickly if it's giving him a lot of lengthy responses all the time. So once you've kind of got there, that's when you've got some kind of a diagram, that's when you start looking into actually implementing it and converting this conversational flow into something that you can actually execute on, but also that you can be agile at the same time. So let's talk about that. What we started doing is we started looking at best practices from other places. If you look at web apps, you'd need interaction between the designers, between the developers, the internationalization folk. You need them all coming together to figure out the layout of a desktop app or the layout of a web page or a mobile app and try to figure out how to make it responsive. In the voice world, we wanted something that would get that sense of that layout of that app in one place that everyone could understand, not something that had to be technical. And so that was the motivation to create something inspired by HTML. And while looking at common patterns, we noticed that most apps have things like menus and forms. Now, in the voice world, we call them, like decisions or decision trees at a more complicated level, or we call them like dialogues, right? But those two basic elements form a large part of your app. And then there's a lot of other details which we can get into once we start in this space. So let me talk about those two big elements and show you what it would look like in this language that we created. Now, I do want to mention that we created this simple representation partly to communicate amongst ourselves, partly because some of the teams that I've been collaborating with do use something similar, whether it is in a graphical format. But we realized that if we sort of locked down some of it, it would be easier to share and talk about it. And also, one of the nice parts of it is that we've actually implemented an engine that runs on this stuff. So it's part of some of the stuff that we've open sourced. Love you guys to try it out, and I'll talk about that in a bit. So what does a menu look like? We call them decisions because a user needs to make a decision. We see it as the most basic building block of a voice app. One can easily say that a voice app is basically a set of decisions that go on and on. Now, we want to figure out the right primitives and the right places to use these things. And in this particular case, if you're thinking about like a calculator and you want to have what two numbers to add, putting this into a skill, into our engine will have it prompt you, what two numbers would you like to add? And if you say 5 and 7, then it says the sum of 5 and 7 is, and it runs a little code and it'll tell you that, right? The point here, though, is not that particular example, but you can take these decisions and you can nest them. Instead of that say statement up there, you can put another decision inside it, and you can actually spec out how you want the app to work. And the engine under the covers, and you can, of course, do that yourself, you can do a lot more based on that. You can onboard users to a sophisticated product that they may have bought. For example, somebody buys a car, maybe let them talk to a skill where they can get all the information about the car, or whether they can get an access a knowledge base about the warranty information. We were talking about it at a panel yesterday about it. Right? You could do interviews designed in a very similar way. But that's sort of one of the common bits. It's that menu aspect of going down a tree. The other common aspect that you would see in most web apps, or quite frankly, any kind of app, is that form. A form where you need 3, 4 pieces of information to do something. For example, if you're trying to figure out when is the next flight coming, then the system should ask, oh, is this JetBlue? Is this a flight coming in from Boston? Are you talking about today or the flight coming in tomorrow? Right. There's a bunch of different parameters that you need from a user for that representation. That's essentially what a number of the engines call dialogues, right? And here's a representation of it that we've proposed, that we've been using and we kind of like. You just tell, these are the parameters. If this parameter has not been provided, this is a prompt out there that you can do, and this is a form that I can get that information. You can also put in some code there so that when you have all the bits, it can process it properly. And of course, you can also have code that suggests what parameters are needed. Because in some situations, if you have 2 parameters, you may not necessarily need the third one. So both of these decisions and these dialogues are, at least from our experience, some of the more common use cases. And then we start getting into sort of what I'm going to call the lower level patterns, and more so lower level because they're incredibly important, but you need to sort of focus on them to get the little details of that experience right. It is the idea that you want to have alternate inputs. Sometimes you want to say add the numbers 5 and 3. Some people instead will say 5 plus 3. You need to ideally have a system that handles, these are kind of obvious, handles both kinds of inputs. Similarly, if a system is giving the same response every time and not having alternate responses, it gets very monotonous and people will tune out. One of my favorite ones is that experience level. It's the difference between the beginner user and the advanced user in a system. For the beginner user, somebody using an app for the first time, you might want to say, would you like restaurants that are close by, rated highly, or do you want them selected by cuisine type? In contrast, somebody who's used the app, you don't want to necessarily ask all that details because the person knows it. And finally, one of the things that we felt a little bit of a need for is actually having 2 different primitives, not just having asks, but having an idea of an ask and a prompt, where one of them asks one question at a time, because it's really important. I'm not going to do anything else until you user give me the answer to that question. And the other one prompts up to 3 questions. So I need a bunch of information, I flag them as prompts. The system will say, okay, here are the 3 questions as long as it's not long enough, and it will ask the user and it will wait so that the user can actually respond to that. Using these patterns, we built things. Would love to, we've got an example there that you can check out. It's on our website as well. Would love to hear what you guys do with it, your experiences with it. I would love to actually hear from you, from all of you that are actually building stuff with voice and figuring out what are the kinds of user experience design patterns that you're seeing so that we could share them, and as well as come up with some kind of manual as to what are the things that you want to care about first and then what do you want to care about second, just so that it's not overwhelming for somebody sort of starting to look at it. To a large extent, what I'm trying to do is trying to set it up so that we don't per se have a job, so that there is almost no effort required to create a skill. It just so happens when you're trying to do that, you realize all the additional details. There's so much details to think about with the user experience, even if you know the right primitives to use. And then on the opposite side, there's so much work that needs to be done to get the business logic right. And that's what it takes to build a great app. So, love you to look at Violet. My intention was not to be talking explicitly about Violet. I'd love any feedback on Violet, but more so, I would love feedback on the user experience primitives. What would that mean for you guys? What have I missed? We've gotten Violet. We've been iterating it. It's been open source for the last 9 months. We're getting close to hitting 1.0. I want to really hear feedback from people before we start sort of locking down some of the APIs. And yeah, let us know how it goes. Thank you. Any questions? I'm here right now. Rest of the conference, let me know. But anything so far right now?
Just wondering about some of the things that Salesforce might be putting out with Alexa, or any current plans, anything to that effect?
I cannot talk to our product roadmap, sorry.
Okay.
There is a related question to that I was asked earlier. This is open source. It does have plugins that integrate with Salesforce, but you do not need Salesforce to use this.
On the prompts, why just 3 responses? Could it be more than that?
Sorry, could you?
On the prompts,
Yeah.
You had 3. You could ask up to 3 questions. Why just 3? Was there?
Yeah, this is one of those things that honestly I never asked that question. It felt right. Now, if you feel like we need to change that, I mean, like, we can easily set it up to be configurable. I just looked at a bunch of experiences and tweaked it to have something that I could not focus on the little details, but actually build something bigger. I do also want to mention that this stuff is open source. It's not supported. That being said, we are building a community. We would love to have people engaged. We're not promising any support, I guess. Anything else? Awesome.
Thank you. Thank you, Vineet.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you. Appreciate that, Vineet.